Tonight is our fourth and final part of the Shemittah Series for our Beis Medrash program. Also wanted to let you know that I just received word that Rabbi Spitz is unable to attend due to a medical issue. Will not be giving his class tonight, but that leaves Rabbi Gutenberg's class and Mrs. Woody's class, so please take advantage of those. The title of tonight's presentation is the Prozbol and other rabbinic quote-unquote loopholes. There has been, throughout Jewish history, the attack against the rabbinic community for taking too many advantages with Torah law that has come primarily from within Judaism, from groups that have suggested that the rabbinic community has distorted the biblical tradition in a way that it was never intended. And one example that is pointed to is the Law of Crucible. Now, the word Prozbol, the Gemara tries to explain what it comes from. And the Gemara's explanation is that it has its origins in Aramaic or Persian verbiage having to do with giving a prize to the bull, to the poor man. And there are other explanations for that. If you look, I have it on the second side of the page in the brackets. From the Book of Jewish Concepts by Philip Birnbaum back in the 50s, he says the term Prozbol is explained as a contraction of the Greek words Prozbule, before the council. So we're going to explain what a Prozbol is and what its history is. But in order to be able to do that, we first have to understand one of the things that happens during Shemitah. Up until now, we've been learning that the law of Shemitah is having to do with one's agriculture, that one has to allow his land to remain fallow. He's not allowed to work it in certain ways. He has to make sure that it is hefker, that it is available to everyone, and he's not allowed to hoard produce from the field into his home if it's not available in the field for anyone to the public. There's another law of the Shemitah that is purely financial, and it has to do with what's called Shemittah Series, the cancellation of debts. At the end of the Shemitah year, the Torah says that all financial debts that have reached maturity are canceled. So, if I owe you $100 and that debt matures before the end of the Shemitah year, if you don't collect from me by the end of the Shemitah year, then I can just go, la da 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 da, right? It's Shemitah's over, and I don't have to pay, right? But where do we get this from? This is from the Torah. The Torah says, and I'll just read it from the English translation. This is from Parshas Re'eh, and it says, at the end of every 7 years you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelite. From here the Gemara learns that you only cancel loans that were made to Jews. If a non-Jew owes you money, you can still collect even though Shemitah has elapsed. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. Now, we're going to skip a few psukim, jump to Pasuk Tes, verse 9. The Torah says, be careful, Hishamer Lecha, be very careful, not to harbor this wicked thought. And what's the wicked thought? You'll say to yourself, the 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. What the Torah is basically saying is that there's a great temptation that naturally any person with funds would have. The temptation is that, look, why should I lend my friend money if Shemitah is coming up and he may end up defaulting on the loan, and I won't be able to have any legal recourse against him because of the Shemitah year. So therefore, the Torah says, in order to dispel that, no. Give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. The Torah really says it in the negative. Kilo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. There will never be a shortage of poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. So this is your obligation. Your obligation is, despite the fact that you know that you may end up having the debtor default on the loan, you are still obligated to lend money for those who are needy and for those who are poor. But that doesn't really help. I mean, what is a person supposed to do? Isn't it just a natural psychology that a person is not going to want to lend money to someone who he knows may take advantage of Jewish law? So how are we supposed to get around this? So the first thing you need to know is that the Torah was designed, many halachos, many societal halachos of the Torah were designed for a biblical society that is on a high moral level to begin with. And that is why there's been a general breakdown in so many of the societal laws of the Torah to the point where they cannot be put into practice anymore. And Chazal themselves understood this. Chazal said that even when the Jewish community had political autonomy at one point in history to be able to carry out punishments in their own Batei Din, but when there was too much lawlessness in the land, the Batei Din voluntarily disbanded and recused themselves from being able to preside over certain kinds of cases, such as capital crimes and things like that, because they knew that there was too much of a breakdown in society. There was too much of a disregard for the ethics of the Torah, and therefore many of the societal laws no longer became practical. When I talk about societal laws, I mean laws that are practiced on a societal level. So therefore, mitzvahs that apply to the individual, that don't have to be enforced by a Beis Din. There's no such thing as different periods of history dictating whether those mitzvahs are on or off. Those are always on when they pertain to the individual. But certain halachic societal norms that pertain to a society, like the Torah says, having to do with the cancellation of debts and so forth, there are certain times when there's a general recognition among Chazal that it just ain't working anymore. And we have to try to figure out something to be able to ameliorate the problem. Now, the question, of course, then becomes, how does the law of the cancellation of debts relate to what seems to be an agricultural mitzvah of Shemitah, that the land has to rest every seventh year? The Sefer HaChinuch asks this question: what's the connection between the agricultural mitzvah of a Shabbos for Hashem and the law that debts are supposed to be canceled? So the Sefer HaChinuch writes as follows. He says, Kvar kasafti bekesef talva b'mitzvah shias shvias asay revi'i b'simin samechtes. So the Sefer HaChinuch writes, I've already addressed the general theme behind the mitzvah of Shemitah way back in Parshas Mishpatim. He says, however, ushmitas kesafim, where it's mentioned most expressly, which is in Parshas Re'eh, which we just read, gam kein achar oso hatam nimshach. He says, whatever I wrote as far as the reasons for the law of Shemitah agriculturally also applies for the reason for the cancellation of debts. And what is it? L'lamed nafshenu b'midot ha'me'ulot midat ha'nedivut va'ayin tov. One of the reasons of Shemitah has to do with metaphysics. There's a metaphysical benefit for the land to rest during the Shemitah year. But the Sefer HaChinuch tells us that there's an ethical benefit to the Jewish people who are living in Eretz Yisrael. When you're living in Eretz Yisrael, you learn the quality of generosity, you learn the quality of emunah, a trust and belief in Hashem, and you learn the quality of anything that I have in life is really not mine, it's all a gift from God. Those are all the things that you learn by forcing yourself as a farmer to not work the soil and be able to freely share whatever you have with everyone else in the world. That's the ethical teaching that Shemitah provides us with. And therefore the same thing is true with Shmitat Ksafim. He says, V'nikva bilvavenu habitachon hagadol b'shem baruch hu. That through this law we establish within our hearts a tremendous trust in God. Va'az tichshar nafshenu lekabel tov me'es adon hakol kalul habracha v'harachamim. And why does God want to engender this feeling of bitachon within ourselves, because the more bitachon a Jew has, the more worthy he becomes of receiving Hashem's blessings. In other words, don't think that this is conditioning for the sake that God says you have to be a better person. The purpose of the conditioning, says the Sefer HaChinuch, is that the more of a Baal Bitachon you are, the more worthy you become of the blessings that I wish to bestow upon you. I want to share you the bounty of Eretz Yisrael. I want to give you the fullest blessing possible that Eretz Yisrael can provide you. But in order to be able to do that, you have to show your worthiness of living in this holy place, and that you do that by showing bitachon, by behaving in a certain way during the Shemitah year. וגם נמצא מזה גדר חזק ומחיצה של ברזל להתרחק מאוד מן הגזל. And then the Sefer Chinuch writes further. He says that practicing Shmitat Ksafim, of cancellation of debts, also engenders within us a very strong aversion to theft, taking things that don't belong to us. Umin hachemda b'chol asher l're'enu, it also engenders within us a rejection of this trait of coveting, of desiring things that belong to someone else. Because if we already feel this sense of even things that are rightfully mine, I have to abdicate and I have to give up, I have to relinquish, so then certainly things that are someone else's, I will have no desire for them. Ki nisa kal v'chomer b'nafsheinu lomar, we'll make a kal v'chomer, a logical argument. Afilu hilvitiv mamoni, v'higia shnat hashmita, amra Torah la'ashmit biyado hamilva, that even though it was my money that I lent him, and the loan has matured, yet the Torah says, let him keep it. Shelo ligzol v'shelo lachmos mishelo, kol shekain shero'i lo lihitrachek ad hakatzeh hacharon. And therefore the Torah says, then surely you'll know that this hunger for money will be eradicated eventually, and therefore it'll distance you to the nth degree from trying to take advantage of other people and taking money that's not rightfully yours. So the Sefer HaChinuch tries to provide us with that connection between Shmitas Ksafim and Shmitas Karka, the agricultural Shabbos and the cancellation of debt. So it's, again, it breeds within the practitioner a certain kind of breadth of giving, of relinquishing, and of not desiring someone else's property, and also placing one's trust in Hashem. So now, as I mentioned, we have this problem. We have a problem that, okay, that's all very well and good. For the virtuous, moral Jewish community, this is a great mitzvah to put into practice. But as we know, there's a general principle in Jewish history of niskatnu hadoros, that every generation that moves further and further away from Har Sinai, at least it seems to be that way, seems to degenerate one small degree. And therefore, what are we to do with a community that really doesn't value this kind of education that the Torah is trying to condition us with, and really says, forget it, I'm just not going to lend people money. So I'm in violation of the Torah, which says, don't say that. Don't say you're not going to lend people money. So comes along Hillel, who lives in the Second Temple era, and he sees the community around him is not really able to adapt to this law. He sees that the values of the community have degenerated, they can't handle it. So therefore the Gemara in Gittin, and we'll just read the English, it's on the bottom of the page, of the first side. Hillel instituted the Prozbol. Now we have learned elsewhere, a Prozbol prevents the remission of debts in the sabbatical year. So what is the Prozbol? It seems like it's a loophole. It is a mechanism that stops the cancellation of debts and allows me to collect that which is owed to me, even though the Shemitah year has already elapsed.
Yes, yeah, right. Yes.
So how does that work? This is one of the regulations made by Hillel the Elder. For he saw that people were unwilling to lend money to one another and disregarded the precept laid down by the Torah, beware that there not be a base thought in your heart, saying, etc. People were saying to themselves, I'm not going to lend money as the Shemitah year comes closer. He therefore decided to institute the Prozbol. The text of the Prozbol is as follows. This is what you do for the Prozbol. What you say is, you take a piece of paper and you write down on the piece of paper as follows: I hand over to you so-and-so, the judges in such and such a place, my bonds, so that I may be able to recover any money owing to me from so-and-so at any time I shall desire. And the Prozbol was to be signed by the judges or witnesses. Okay, and once you present the piece of paper to them, then you are the loan is no longer in your hands. You are no longer the owner of that debt. The Beis Din becomes the owner of the debt. Anyone remember we learned about this concept of Otsar Beis Din last week? One of the loopholes of Shemitah is that what you do is you basically take your produce and remand it over to the Beis Din. The Torah says that it has to be hefker. Well, Beis Din essentially is considered that same kind of hefker. It's ownerless. There's no singular ownership of that produce anymore. So you fulfilled the precepts of Shemitah for your agriculture, and therefore Beis Din can distribute that produce freely. It's a similar concept over here. You're basically saying the debt is no longer mine. It belongs to the community, the communal leaders that are in the Beis Din. And therefore, the Torah only cancels personal debts. It does not cancel debts that are owned by an entire Beis Din, which really doesn't. You can't define who is the owner of that debt because it's a corporate entity. It's not an individual. Okay, so that's the mechanism by which you can avoid the cancellation of debts. And essentially, once the Shemitah year is over, Beis Din will basically say, we appoint you as the shaliach of the Beis Din to go ahead and collect the money that's owed to the Beis Din. And once you collect that money, you get to keep it. Beis Din says, okay, we'll give it to you. That's essentially the mechanism. That's the loophole. So you may look at this halacha a bit askance. And you may say, how can Hillel do this? I mean, after all, you've got a Torah law that says that Hashem wants all debts to be canceled. We saw in the Sefer HaChinuch that the theme behind the cancellation of debts is for the purpose of embedding within people a certain moral quality, a certain moral characteristic of emuna, of bitachon, of vatranut, of generosity and relinquishing ownership. And here you have Hillel, who's completely circumventing the entire theme of the Torah. How can he do this? What right does he have to create this rabbinic loophole? So I want to share with you, the Gemara is going to undertake this discussion, but before we look at the Gemara's answer, let's take a look in the Kuzari from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. In the third essay of the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi changes gears, and I'll just give you just a brief structuring of the book of the Kuzari. The Kuzari is structured in 5 different essays. The first, and it's structured in such a way where it's structured as a dialogue between a pagan king who converts to Judaism based on the arguments of a rabbi who he's having a disputation with. And the rabbi offers him convincing arguments as to why he should convert to Judaism and why Judaism is the superior faith and it makes the most sense. In the third essay, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi focuses on one issue more specifically, and that is Rabbinic Judaism. Because there were 2 threats to Judaism in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's lifetime. The primary threat was from without, but there was a secondary threat that was from within, which was from the Karaite community, who accused Rabbinic Judaism of distorting what the Torah really wanted. And there was a famous argument by the Karaites that the rabbis have taken liberties by creating loopholes around the Torah law. And you can certainly see how the Prozbol would fit into that category. And we're coming into the middle of a discussion where the king, who's already at this stage of the book converted to Judaism, but still has a lot of questions. And he says, I noticed these Karaites seem a lot more sincere, and they're fervent in their prayer. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, that doesn't really mean anything. Just because someone shows greater sincerity during their prayers doesn't mean that they're closer to God. Sometimes a person who doesn't have a sense of confidence that what they're doing is correct may show greater sincerity in order to reinforce their uncertainty. And the Karaites really are rudderless because they don't have defined, concrete explanations of certain passages in the Chumash, which are extremely ambiguous. And so, because some of their more recent rabbinic leaders in the Karaite community have defined for them anew what these things mean, they take to them more fervently to show and to prove that they're right. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are right. Sometimes when a person has a sense of security because of a long tradition that what they're doing is correct, you see that they may seem more passive, but it's a passive or a relaxed nature because of a confidence that what they're doing is correct. So the Kuzari says, we're coming in the third essay, the paragraph 50, this being the case, I concede that the rabbinical Jew who unites both facets of Judaism is superior to the Karaite in both external practice and internal devotion. Such a person's heart will be at peace with his Torah, since it is a tradition from the trustworthy sages whose wisdom emanates from God. As for the Karaite, no matter what level he reaches through his devotion, his heart will not be at peace, because all of his worship is based on logic and reasoning. He therefore cannot be at peace, nor can he be confident that his actions are in fact desirable to the Creator. He will furthermore be disturbed that among other nations, many people are even more fervent than he in their own religious devotion. Right? Just because sometimes Muslims are more fervent in their religious devotion doesn't make them right. It just makes them passionate. And sometimes passion is driven not for the right motivation. Sometimes passion is a very, very negative thing. You have, if you're passionate for bloodshed, that's not a good passion, right? So you want to channel that passion for bloodshed and do it in the name of religion. Well, that's not really a good thing. No one would. So just passion by itself, the Karaites may show more passion, but that doesn't by itself make it right. So, but then the Khazar king takes a different tack, and he says, but I still would like to ask you about the Eruv, a leniency in the commandment of the Sabbath. How can you permit what God forbade using such a despicable and lowly legal subterfuge? So the question, of course, stands on its own. I'm sure you may have had to field this question in the past on your own. Someone comes to you and says, now let me get this straight. Torah says you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos, right? And you can take a string and put it around a city, put it around your town, and all of a sudden you're allowed to carry. Well, yes, of course, because it's, putting a string on the telephone poles is like creating doorways. When you have doorways around a city, it lets you carry. Oh, and who invented this idea? Well, the rabbis did. Well, the rabbis who invented the Eruv, how could they create this flimsy loophole around a biblical prohibition of carrying in a Rishus HaRabim on Shabbos? So, of course, what's the fallacy of the argument? Someone? Tell me what's the fallacy of the argument?
Wasn't it all given at Sinai, the Torah Shabbat?
No, not the Eruv was not. The Eruv, the Gemara says, was actually invented, if I remember the Gemara correctly, it was invented by Shlomo HaMelech. It is a very ancient tradition, but it doesn't go back beyond Shlomo HaMelech. He created the institution of Eruvin. So, and it was an amelioration of the inconveniences of not being able to carry on Shabbos. So, if the Torah doesn't want me to carry on Shabbos in a Rishus HaRabim, how could the rabbis come along and say, it's okay, we'll give you a way to do it. Don't worry about it. Isn't that disturbing? Shouldn't that be disturbing to you? So what's the fallacy of the argument? Somebody tell me how you've been able to justify carrying on Shabbos.
You're going to do it anyway.
You're going to do it anyway. Okay, good answer.
The Torah gives the rabbis the ability to do this.
The Torah gives the rabbis the ability to what? To suspend biblical law?
To interpret biblical law.
To interpret biblical law. To say that the Torah really doesn't forbid me from carrying, or if I create under these circumstances. Well, how do you feel about that, David?
And you're not even a lawyer,
I have to scratch my beard a little bit. Yeah.
All right. So let me tell you what the fallacy of the argument is. The fallacy of the argument is that really it's not biblically prohibited to carry from your house out into the street on Shabbos. And the reason is because the street is not a Rishus Harabim biblically. There is a very specific definition of what a public domain is, which the Gemara tells us based upon the way the Jews traveled in the desert. A biblical domain, at least the way that Rashi understands the Gemara, is that it has to be a thoroughfare that stretches from one end of the city to the other that's at least 16 amot wide, and that you have 600,000 passers-by on that road on a daily basis. There are very few cities which have such a street, and therefore most cities and most towns do not qualify as a Rishus Harabim. So really, from the biblical standpoint, there is no prohibition of carrying out on the street. In most cities. Toronto, we're not sure about. We'll get into Toronto in just a second. So, based on that, why aren't we allowed to carry out into the street without an eruv? So the rabbis invented a domain called a Carmelite. You've heard of the Carmelite before? The Carmelists? What is a Carmelis? Is a rabbinically invented domain which is neither a completely private domain, but nor does it qualify as a public domain that the Torah was addressing. They said, look, it has certain features of a public domain because it's not owned by one person, it's not walled in on all sides, and it's not something that is one person has control over. But it's not a public domain either. So therefore, because it has certain resemblance to a public domain, we will treat it rabbinically like a public domain, and we will not allow you to carry from your house into a Carmelis on Shabbos. So that's why, if I'm up in the cabin, let's say, up by the Muskoka, right? And I'm in my cottage for Shabbos, and there's no eruv around my cottage, then the halacha is really, from the biblical standpoint, I can schlep my garden furniture all over my yard if I want to, even without an eruv. The rabbi said I can't because it's called a Carmelis. Now that I understand that this is only rabbinically prohibited, the invention of an eruv is by the very same rabbis who told us about this stringency called the Carmelis. And they told us that even though we told you to treat a Carmelis like it's a Rishus Harabim, we will nevertheless give you one dispensation, that if you create a fence or some kind of barrier around the Carmelis, and you create some kind of mechanism whereby the entire enclosed area is under one unitary corporate ownership instead of being owned by separate people, we will allow you to treat this no longer as a rabbinically prohibited area, and you can carry from your home into that area. So it's basically what we say is Heim Amru v'Heim Amru. The very same rabbis who told you to treat a Carmelis like a Rishus Harabim are the very same rabbis who gave you the remedy of the eruv. So it's not the rabbis countermanding a biblical law, it's the rabbis alleviating a rabbinic prohibition in the first place. Am I making myself clear?
But by the same token, why they even think of that rabbinic prohibition to begin with?
Because this is what the rabbis have been doing for centuries. This was their mandate. Create a figurative fence around the Torah. Safeguard the Torah by doing things that are stringencies so that you don't come to violate biblical law. Don't carry into a Carmelis lest you carry out into a real Rishus Harabim. Okay? So, but we don't want to make life so inconvenient for you, and so we'll let you carry as long as you have an eruv. The same principle, by the way, applies to the law of muktzah. There's no biblical law of muktzah. The rabbis created the laws of muktzah, and according to one opinion, the reason why they created laws of muktzah is to prevent a person from carrying into Rishus Harabim on Shabbos. But there are certain things that are non-muktzah. And the rabbis have the discretion to be able to declare what is and is not muktzah, because they're the ones who invented the concept of muktzah in the first place. So therefore, if they invented this concept of Carmelists, they also have a right to invent a mechanism which can alleviate the problem of Carmelists. And this is exactly what we're going to read in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So in paragraph 51 he says, the rabbi said, heaven forbid that a whole group of saintly and wise people would agree to a law which would undo a Torah restriction. On the contrary, they exhort us to make a fence for the Torah. One of the fences that they made was the prohibition of transferring objects from private to public property and vice versa, which is something that the Torah did not restrict. He's talking here about the Carmelists. Afterwards, they created a leniency within this fence. They did this so that their decree would not be perceived on the same level as Torah law, and so that people would have some freedom in performing their regular activities on Shabbos. They wanted people to have this freedom in a permissible fashion through the making of an Eruv. This was done in order to create some recognizable distinction between that which is completely permitted, namely a wholly private domain, that which is completely prohibited by the Torah, namely a public domain, and that which is prohibited because of offense, namely the rabbinical public domain, Carmelists. Okay? So I hope that sort of lays the foundation for you. It becomes a little bit more complicated when you deal with a very large city like Toronto, which does have certain parts of the city which may really qualify as a Reshus HaRabim. So for example, the 401. Does the 401 qualify as a Reshus HaRabim? It very well may, because it goes from one end of the city to the other. It's quite wide, and you could potentially have 600,000 cars on a really busy day passing over the 401, just crossing over Bathurst. So how do we solve that problem? Well, the answer is that we fence off the 401 so that it is no longer it no longer connects directly into the domain that we consider to be the Carmelists. And that becomes a little bit more technical because the area of the overpass of the 401 is elevated above the street. It is fenced off except for the on-ramp and the off-ramp, and that is considered to be sufficient segregation from the regular city streets so that it is not something that is considered to be part of the Carmelists, which is our regular city streets down the Bathurst corridor. Okay? But it's a much more in-depth discussion to be able to understand how that mechanism works. So now that I've given you this example of the Eruv, let's see how we apply this to the Prozbol. And we'll see that the Gemara really has the same problem that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi tried to detail with the Eruv. So if you go back to the top of this page, we continue in our discussion in the Gemara. The Gemara asks, but is it possible that where, according to the Torah, the seventh year releases Hillel, Hillel should ordain that it should not release? How can it be that the Torah says that debts are canceled, and Hillel comes along and he comes up with this rabbinic rule that debts are not canceled? How can he do that? How can he circumvent? How can he countermand Torah law? Abaya said, and this is a very important answer, he was dealing with the sabbatical year in our time. And he went on the principle laid down by Rebbe. As it has been taught, Rebbe says, it is written, now this is the matter of the release, every creditor shall release. So without going into too much detail in the text of the Gemara, because I don't want to get us bogged down, Rebbe, or also known as Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, is of the opinion that Shemitah in today's world only is a rabbinic law. Shemitah in today is only a rabbinic law. And if Shemitah is only a rabbinic law, therefore, what did the rabbi say? Really, biblically, debts are not canceled in today's world. The rabbis came along and said, listen, we want you to practice Shemitah the way that it was practiced in the times of the Torah, so therefore let your land remain fallow and cancel all debts. Hillel saw that the rabbi's rule was actually doing more harm than good. Why? Because there's a biblical prohibition of not lending a poor man money, which is not removed just because there's no Shemitah. The Torah says, do not be stingy, do not be a miser, and say, I'm not going to lend a person money because I think he may default on the loan. So Hillel saw that the rabbinic rule that debts are canceled was actually causing people to violate the biblical law of not lending money. So he decided, therefore, to create a mechanism which would allow you, through the use of that mechanism, to circumvent the rabbinic law so that you could fulfill the biblical law of being able to lend the poor man money. So that's the way it works. Now, the question then becomes, why is Shemitah only b'derabanan bisman hazeh? What is it about today that makes Shemitah no longer a biblical law? We don't have a Beis HaMikdash? Well, where do you see that the Beis HaMikdash is linked with the practice of Shemitah? If you told me that there was something sacrificial about Shemitah, then I could understand it. But there are other agricultural laws like Trumas and Maestros and Challah. Those things do apply, even biblically, at least according to many poskim, apply when in the absence of a temple. So we have to figure out what's going on over here. So the Gemara actually has this discussion, and there's a debate as to what the Gemara really means. But the way Rashi learns the Gemara is, the reason why Shemitah is only biblical today is because the Yovel, the Jubilee year, does not apply anymore today. And why does the Jubilee year, the Yovel year, every 50th year, why do we not have every 50th year of a Shemitah cycle that we have also another year of letting the land remain fallow and freeing slaves and real estate reverting back to its original owner in Israel? The reason why we don't have it is because the Gemara in Erechin says that you need to have all of Israel living in Eretz, all the tribes of Israel living in Eretz Yisrael, in order for the Jubilee year to be extant. And if the Jubilee year is not extant, then the Shemitah year is not extant either. Now, when we say that the Shemitah year is not extant, there's a big debate as to what that means. One thing is clear, that the cancellation of debts is no longer biblical. But what about the other aspects of the Shemitah year? What about the agricultural laws of the Shemitah year? Is that also only rabbinical bisman hazeh, or is it midioraisa bisman hazeh? So this is a very, very long debate. There's a huge machlokes among both the Rishonim and the Achronim, both the earlier medieval commentators and the later commentators. There's even a debate as to what the Rambam himself holds, because the Rambam himself is ambiguous. And in one place, the Beit Yosef, who's the great commentator on the Rambam, Rav Yosef Cairo, in one place he says that according to the Rambam, Shemitah is deoraisa, and in another place he says that according to the Rambam, Shemitah is derabanan. It's very, very unclear. It's very, very murky. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons why the Heter Mechira that we talked about last week is under attack is because it really only works if you hold that Shemitah bisman hazeh is derabanan. And because there are a number of very, very serious, very, very heavy authorities who say that Shemitah bisman hazeh is deoraisa, that's another reason why a person should not rely on the Heter Mechira today in Israel. So, but one thing is clear, the cancellation of debts, that component of Shemitah is very clearly midirabanan, because Yovel is not extant, and you need a majority, or you need really all 12 tribes to be living in Israel. Now, there are different ways of learning that Gemara, that you need all 12 tribes in Israel. The simple understanding is that if the 10 tribes are still in exile, we won't have Yovel. But there are certain authorities who say that as long as you have a majority of the Jewish world population living in Eretz Yisrael, then the laws of Shemitah and Yovel go back to a biblical status completely. This has very serious repercussions, because within the next 20 years, in your lifetimes, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a majority of world Jewry living in Eretz Yisrael, God willing. Because based on the population growths and the demographic shifts of the Jewish world, we see that the population in the Golah is diminishing, and the population in Eretz Yisrael is increasing every single year. So it's only a matter of time. Even today, this happened just about 5 years ago. There are more Jews in Eretz Yisrael today than in any other country in the world. That much we know. But there still is not a majority of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. You have maybe now 6 or 7 million Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, and the total of world Jewry is about 20 million. So you still have a majority of living in Chutz La'aretz, but that will change within the next decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. We know that's going to shift, and at that point, according to some authorities, Shemitah will revert back to being a deoraisa, in which case you won't be able to rely on Prozbol anymore, according to the Gemara, and you won't be able to certainly rely on any other of these loopholes that help you get around using a produce that's grown in Eretz Yisrael. Yeah?
That Jewry in Israel is less because...
Sure, right. Well, that's part of it, intermarriage, of course, yes.
But it's not really that so many people, and people are moving over, but people here are less Jewish.
Right, so there's attrition, there's a lower birth rate in Chutz La'aretz. There's a number of factors, right? Yeah.
But in Hillel's time, there weren't more Jews living, the majority of Jews were not living in Israel. And also I'd like to know, was there ever a time where Jews were up to this high standard of keeping Shemitah ever in history? Could they do this type of thing where they would lend money in the Shemitah year and not ask for that? Was there ever a time in almost 6,000 years?
That's a very good question. I cannot accurately answer that question. What we do know is that we saw in Divrei Hayamim a couple weeks ago that the reason the Navi says that the Jews were exiled for 70 years is to correspond to the 70 Shemitah cycles that they did not observe in the 400 and something years that they were on their land. So
they never could.
What's that?
They could never.
So it seems like even when the Jews were in their spiritual heyday, they were not observing it the way they were supposed to. And of course, the calling therefore is for us to be able to build a third temple which reaches an even higher level than the first temple. And therefore our calling is to be able to reach that madrega when we can become even better, and that we can observe Shemitah fully and to its fullest extent, and to let the land rest, and to lend people money with the knowledge that if they don't pay back, I'm moichel, and all of these other things. Yes, David?
The original plan of Shemittah Ksafim is that when you set up a loan with somebody, there's a due date for the loan.
Right.
So is that to be in place for when a person defaulted on a loan, or say if Reuven lends Shimon money that the due date is past the Shemitah year?
So if the due date, if the loan does not mature until into the 8th year, so then Shemitah does not cancel the debt. Shemitah only cancels debts which mature before the end of Shemitah. So let's say you come to me today, David, I'll come to you, right? I come to you, I ask you, David, lend me $100, I need it for 30 days. Right? And you give me, you're such a nice boy, you give me $100, you trust me, and nothing, I just don't have the money, sorry, Dave. And a month goes by, 2 months go by, 3 months go by. That's when we say that if by Rosh Hashanah this coming year I don't pay you back, then you have to just write it off. But if you give me a long-term loan, let's say it's a 5-year loan, right? And you give me the loan, and I don't have to pay you back for 5 years, so then Shemitah does not wipe out that debt. Yeah. Alan.
Source number 1. The last verse said, in your land. And what would do with Prozbol and Toronto?
Why? So why do we need to do a Prozbol in Toronto? So the Gemara has a way of learning the psukim to teach us that whereas Shemitah of agriculture only applies in Eretz Yisrael, Shemitah Ksafim applies throughout the world for all Jews. You have to go through the Gemaras carefully to see it, but it's from the exegetical teachings of the Gemara that they learn how to read the psukim in a certain way. One more question.
Doesn't it mess up the calendar of the Shemitah?
It does. There's actually there's an opinion of the Rambam that Yovel was practiced in the Second Temple period, only rabbinically, just to keep a marker so that we would have a consistent 50-year count. But today, it's understood that we only do a 49-year cycle. Whereas we only do 7-year cycles. We don't even bother with a 50th year at all. We just do another 6-7 years after the last Shemitah year. And so, is it going to throw us off? Yes, it will throw us off from what would have been the Yovel had we all been in Eretz Yisrael. But once we all come back, we'll start the timer, we'll go back we'll put the reset button, and we'll go back to year 1 of the 50-year cycle. Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming.